All right. I'm Burgess. I am joined by Matt McManus and Russell Sbriglia for part two of the Sunday night debate breakdown on Jordan Peterson's 2019 debate with Slavoj Žižek. I know it said in the description, I think probably a little too optimistically, that we're going to finish it tonight. I was just looking at this, and I think the amount of time left in the debate itself is very closely similar to the amount of time that we're probably going to go tonight. So I'm going to take a stand right now and say we are not going to finish this tonight. There's going to be a part three, but we can at least get through much more of it. It's certainly not going to be like part one, when after our interview with the man himself, which if you missed that, we put it out as a as a standalone video yesterday. We basically just went through Peterson's opening statement, pausing a lot because the number, like it's one of those things where he manages to get things wrong with every word. I think that there are like commas that get wrong. So it took some time to get through, but we got through it. After that, we're going to be doing a lot less, stopping and starting. Like we could probably watch Žižek's whole opening statement and then talk about it. But although if either of you guys do have things that you want to mention while you're thinking about it, just speak up and I'll pause. But we're going to at least get through a bunch of what's left. Then, as I say, we'll finish it up. Next Sunday. Should also mention for anybody who's tuning in just to watch this, that the next episode of the regular show is tomorrow night, which should be a really good one. We've got Sam Cedar on to revisit some of the highlights of his many debates with libertarians, and then going to have Jason Miles and Toure Reed on to talk about some of what Toure talks about in his excellent book, Toward Freedom, and the way, just sort of generally think about our way out of the, late capitalist hellscape that we're living in. But anything that either of you guys wanted to sort of touch back on from the opening part of the debate before we start back up again?
I'm sure that a lot of your listeners have thumbed through, at the very least, Marx's eloquently titled, A Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, because that's kind of how I felt last class, or last time, just every single fucking line that he said. We had to have a long debate about it, not because we wanted to talk about, all the virtues, but just to explain what was wrong with it. And I thought it was a really productive and fun conversation. Although I will admit, at the end, it felt a bit like bullying almost. No, I'm just saying.
There was so much though that needed to be. I mean, I went back and watched part of it to see, to try to take myself out of the experience of us doing it live, and then say, okay, how many times did we stop? And we stopped a lot, but each and every time was necessary. So,
That's right.
I just, maybe just a way of sort of prefacing, because we're going to start off with Slavoj's remarks, or his opening statement was, I remember that he, I think I mentioned this, Ben, when you and I were talking about the debate a few months ago, but Slavoj always shows up somewhere with a text, and the degree to which he sticks to the text is, he's very good at reading audiences. And so if he comes with a very, and it's not that he, when he gives a presentation, that he has this sort of even among, more theoretical audiences, or, more sort of exclusively academic audiences. I mean, he manages to use less jargon, especially talking, which is impressive, talking about Lacan and, Hegel, and, but he usually ditches the script pretty soon into it and extemporizes. But in general, but this, it was almost sacrosanct. He stuck to it, and that was just one of the things that I was surprised by, in a good way.
Funny story about that.
Laser focused.
I was going to say, funny story about that. So my wife and I met at a conference, the Birkbeck Critical Theory Summer School, which if you're listening, London, I'd like to come back at some time, always waiting for an invite. But anyway, he was giving a presentation there for 3 days, and he was supposed to talk on Heidegger and Nazism, because that was the big issue at the time. And he got into it for about 2 minutes, said a few things about Heidegger, and then just went off talking about, I think it was Syriza, Greece, debt crisis, and we got the Heidel. And somebody chimed in being like, blah, blah, this is all very interesting, but could you get back to Heidegger and Nazism? He was just like, that's so boring. I just don't care about that. I was like, it is pretty boring. So just let the man speak. You know what I mean? That's what we're here for.
Yeah, I mean, I saw somebody, when we released the standalone video, our interview with him last night, somebody in the comments, and, I'm a little ashamed. I still do that. Michael Brooks used to yell at me about reading YouTube comments, but it's like, why would you do that? But somebody in the comments is saying that anytime, it says, an interview is titled Žižek on blah, 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 right? It's always a little bit of false advertising, the way he goes between subjects. Although honestly, I think that there was quite a bit, about the debate with Peterson in there. But yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing I would flag is that, believe it or not, it actually occurred to me after we did part 1 last week that there was something important that Peterson, got wrong in that opening statement that we didn't even touch on, which is that when he's talking about, he's doing his Steven Pinker thing, and he's talking about like world poverty reduction. Like we talked a little bit about how that involved, like, making that claim work statistically is a little dodgy. There was an old TMBS segment about this, Pinker copying a stinker about poverty stats. But to the extent that it is true, like the stuff in the last several decades, and this is a really important point, is actually overwhelmingly concentrated in one country, right? Which is China. And I'm certainly not I'm certainly not I'm certainly not an apologist for Deng's China, by any stretch of the imagination. I think that it, I think it's got a really, I've been to China and I loved it, but like the political system has nothing to recommend it, but also it is like a little.
It's just 1 million Uyghurs, Ben. I mean, it's statistic in the grand scheme of history, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, I'm not going to defend any of that, or certainly the crackdowns on on people in like student, like Marxist study groups. In fact, as Slavoj Žižek, I remember, said in one of his articles about this, like one of the most subversive things you can do in China today is read Marx and take it seriously. So students in like Marxist study groups who actually read it, took it seriously, and decided to like help workers organize, dissident trade unions, and and then got disappeared for their troubles. So I'm certainly not a defender of any of that, but also just in terms of intellectual honesty, saying, and this is the line that you have to take to make sense of what Peterson's saying, that like it's all about, like, it's like you can put it all in the capitalism column. Right, everything China has achieved in that regard in the last several decades, it's just not honest. I mean, you've got look at the comparative stats for how quickly China has been able to develop and and sort of transition people from those peasant huts to modern apartment buildings, and compare it to like to any other country in the same time period. Like, China is certainly not, my idea of an egalitarian socialist society by any stretch of the imagination, but clearly there is a much bigger role for state planning in its economic mechanism, than in a normal capitalist country. And I think if we're just going to be honest about this, that does have something to do with the fact that they've been able to do this quickly and efficiently.
Yeah, and one of the things that I quite consistently bring up is not only is this narrative one-sided, but it actually doesn't do credit to a lot of the people who were instrumental in improving human welfare, but who didn't do it for reasons that were motivated by the market. One of my personal heroes is Norman Borlaug, again, architect of the Green Revolution, arguably a man who saved 1 billion lives. And the way he did it was by inventing new forms of grain that were resistant to diseases and weather, and releasing them patent-free to the people who needed them. right? And I'm not saying that philanthropy is no, never that. God, I dad get me so much trouble.
Marion's not in the market for some sister wives.
No, not as far as I know. Oh, Jesus Christ! Yeah, don't even fucking talk to her about that. Long story short, what was I saying? Yes, Norman Borlaug, billion lives. Obviously, private philanthropy is not going to save the world, but it's important to recognize that the integral role that individuals like him played in conjunction with state actors, NGOs, etc., was instrumental in bringing about higher qualities of life for millions and hundreds of millions of people in the developing world. And that silly little chart that they keep on bringing up, it's like, oh, just look, everything got better after we introduced industrial machinery, is really almost a comically one-sided tale.
You mean there was a labor movement that actually worked to improve worker conditions, and that wouldn't have happened, without any sort of agitation against capitalism? Huh.
Yeah, who would have thought, Ross? Those people were just the ones who were saying silly things like we shouldn't have children as young as 8 working in the coal mines. We would have gotten where we were a lot faster if busybodies like them weren't interfering with the natural order of things.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And by the way, I also saw somebody bring up South Korea in the chat, and again, not a system I like, since during the time period when South Korea was doing its really rapid industrializing, it was ruled by a series of right-wing military dictators. But also, they sure didn't do it by following the economic advice of the Chicago School. They did it with actually pretty aggressive protectionism, which they could get away with for Cold War reasons, that other countries, the global South, couldn't. Because credit where credit's due. The dictators thought that you couldn't be a real country if you didn't make your own cars, and that was something that built up the economy much more rapidly than they would have done. Following the playbook of free market economics, which is whatever. It's a small point, but it's also sometimes the way that the Petersons and the Pinkers will talk about this, it's almost like. And whatever. I know Pinker especially is kind of centrist, not it's not a super libertarian, but sometimes still just
Steve Pinker just believes in reason, Ben. Unlike all the rest of us, he alone sees the world as it truly is, knows what must be done, and we all benefit from just being quite as reasonable as a reasonable man like he is.
Yeah, well, I did. I did do. I usually don't do editorializing like this in class, but in 2018, I taught a class on Hume, Kant in the 18th century at Rutgers, and at the end, I on the last day of the last lecture, I said one of the things you should be able to get out of this class is that if you ever read that Steven Pinker book about the Enlightenment, you should now understand that he has no idea what he's talking about. But which is just literally, doesn't even have to do with his conclusions. He just literally doesn't, But since his whole thing is about, his whole thing in that book, it's about the Enlightenment is all about, sort of uncritical celebration of the powers of, reason to bring about knowledge. And people who didn't like the book even were still assuming that, but just said that's not a good thing. It's guys, you just read, hundreds of pages of David Hume and Immanuel Kant. It's two of the most important Enlightenment thinkers, who are writing about the limits of reason, right? The book is not called an uncritical celebration of pure reason. That's anyway.
It's surprising too, because I read that book over the last summer, I suppose, since we're getting close to this summer. But I thought it was man, people thought I was mean to Nietzsche. He just fucking lacerates the guy, does not like him at all, can't see any redeeming value in his work, and doesn't seem to have read any of his work. So that probably contributes to that.
Yeah, well, exactly. But all that stuff, when people want to tell that story about the amazing things capitalism, no, of course it has done that, right? Again, we were talking about last time, the opening pages of the Communist Manifesto refer to a great extent about that, but also sometimes this, okay, everything that's impressive is accomplished by virtue of how free the markets are, and anything that's bad is because the extent to which they're unfree. And it just starts reminding me of a Christian apologist saying this, well, the world is beautiful and amazing and testifies to the glory of God. And if you notice anything that doesn't, that's because of original sin. It's
Well, it's a really important point, and I think this is why Slavoj brings this up quite a bit. He's going to do it in his opening statement, but yeah, those numbers are juiced by China, which insofar as I think that, Peterson, whether we want to say like I think his position, at least if we're to take him at his word in what he presents, is more of like, neoliberal. And okay, so yeah, China, I mean, it was capitalism, but it's all, I mean, it's state. I mean, the intervention of the state and authoritarian capitalism versus this sort of neoliberal laissez-faireism that, Peterson seems to be so, I mean, he's not explicit about it, but if I had to guess, I would guess that he's closer to, the Chicago boys than he is classical. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he says like he doesn't talk about it a lot, since he, I mean, as we all know, Jordan likes to just stay in the realm of, generalities, the hierarchy and the dragon of chaos and whatnot. But like but he does use phrases sometimes like markets as free as possible and things like that. Like every now and again, he'll pop out one of those. Like, I don't think economics is, like on that fine grain level is like a subject he spends a lot of time thinking about. But when he does, he seems to have pretty, he seems to, Antonio in the chat says Peterson believes in a mixed economy, laissez-faire for economics. Plan.
Well, here, I'll just read this. This might help, actually. It's from his latest book, Beyond Order. You can check out my review of it for Arc Digital, by the way.
Yeah, I just can't believe when Matt posts on social media the conservative books that I'm just like, oh my God. I feel
Somebody
so
has
bad.
To across. But anyway, like he summarizes his political philosophy here in a way that I think is very consonant with your interpretation, Russ. Not quite Chicago boys, but definitely, Chicago boys with a little bit of ordered liberty conservatism in there. Anyway, the quote is, let us not get too grandiose. We can desire systems that allow us a modicum of peace, security, and freedom, and perhaps the possibility of incremental improvement. That is a miracle in and of itself. We should have the wisdom to doubt that we will produce some positive transformation of individual, society, and nature simultaneously, particularly if those improvements are to be brought about in consequence of our own intrinsic personal goodwill, which is often in too short a supply, despite our protestations to the contrary. And the kind of take that I give on this in the review that I kind of stand by is that he's a bit of an ordered liberty conservative, right? He likes markets and he wants them to be as capitalistic as possible. But he also doesn't mind, throwing in a couple of traditions, trying to compel people using the state or maybe other mechanisms to adopt conventional moral values, particularly the Judeo-Christian values, if necessary, as kind of a prop
that Nietzsche loved so much, his idol.
Well, I mean, this is one of the things I bring up in the review. It's a very odd mix of things that don't really fit all that well together if you actually ponder them for a while, but I'm not really sure, that ideological consistency was really what this was all about. It was about ideology, pure and simple, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's right for sure. And yeah, I mean, like, it's just, I mean, maybe it's an obvious point, but I mean, Peterson is somebody who I think he's just so intense in the way he presents things, and he sounds so sure of himself that it can take a minute to be like, is this just like everything you've ever read that sounded striking and kind of right to you, like, sort of put into a blender?
Well, this is my favorite quote from the new book that I didn't even read, but you know how I mentioned the more than metaphysical way that beliefs make the world? Well, there was a sequel to this in Beyond Order where he talks about how the point of being, big B being, is to make things difficult. So there you go. That's the answer to the riddle of existence that Wittgenstein and Heidegger pondered, right? Yeah. It's to make things hard.
That would actually be interesting if he had anything, non-vapid to say about it, but I'm sure that's just thrown out and then he moves on to the next aphorism.
Yeah, he just kind of throws that out there and you're kind of like, if you decided to devote a whole book to this, maybe it'd be kind of neat. But you can't just fucking throw some ontological point.
I'd like a few paragraphs to flesh that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it is kind of it's so grandiose, though. You know what I mean? The point of being is to make things difficult.
Yeah, no, it's like that. More than metaphysical sense. Like, I don't know what more than metaphysical means. I kind of doubt that Peterson does, but he certainly doesn't tell you and maps a meaning.
Well, and this is why, again, when he sits there in the same book and he says, let's not be too grandiose. I'm always about to roll my eyes a little bit. I'm like, is there any fucking more grandiose thing than a more than metaphysical sense in which beliefs make the world, which allows us to discover that the point of being itself is to make things difficult? I mean, Jesus Christ probably wouldn't have been that ambitious in how we evaluated things, right?
Exactly. All right. Let's watch. Let's watch a few minutes of my favorite Slovenian doing his thing.
Sorry, I just saw this quote by J. Andrew. Make things hard like an erotica novel. That was good.
I can sit there. Thank you, Dr. Peterson. Dr. Žižek, thank you.
I'm going to go grab a whiskey. I'll be right back, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. First, a brief introductory remark. I cannot but notice the irony of how Peterson and I, the participants in this duel of the century, are both marginalized by the official academic community. I'm supposed to defend here the left liberal line against neoconservatives. Really? Most of the attacks on me are now precisely from left liberals. Just remember the outcry against my critique of LGBT plus ideology. And I'm sure that if the leading figures in this field were to be asked if I am fit to stand for them, they would turn in their graves even if they are still alive. So let me begin by bringing together the three notions from the title: happiness, communism, capitalism. In one exemplary case, China today. China in the last decades is arguably the greatest economic success story in human history. Hundreds of millions raised from poverty into middle-class existence. How did China achieve it? The 20th century left was defined by its opposition to the two fundamental tendencies of modernity: the reign of capital with its aggressive market competition, the authoritarian bureaucratic state power. Today's China combines these two features in its extreme form: strong authoritarian state, wild capitalist dynamics. And it's important to note they do it on behalf of happiness of the majority of people. They don't mention communism to legitimize their rule. They prefer the old Confucian notion of a harmonious society. But are the Chinese any happier for all that? Although even the Dalai Lama justifies Tibetan Buddhism in Western terms of the pursuit of happiness and the avoidance of pain, happiness as a goal of our life is a very problematic notion. If we learned anything from psychoanalysis, it is that we humans are very creative in sabotaging our pursuit of happiness. Happiness is a confused notion. Basically, it relies on the subject's inability or unreadiness to fully confront the consequences of his, her, their desire. In our daily lives, we pretend to desire things which we do not really desire, so that ultimately the worst thing that can happen is for us to get what we officially desire. So I agree that human life of freedom and dignity does not consist just in searching for happiness, no matter how much we spiritualize it, or in the effort to actualize our inner potentials. We have to find some meaningful cause beyond the mere struggle for pleasurable survival. However, I would like to add here a couple of qualifications. First, since we live in a modern era, we cannot simply refer to an unquestionable authority to confer a mission or task on us. Modernity means that, yes, we should carry the burden, but the main burden is freedom itself. We are responsible for our burdens. Not only are we not allowed cheap excuses for not doing our duty, duty itself should not serve as an excuse. We are never just instruments of some higher cause. Once traditional authority loses its substantial power, It is not possible to return to it. All such returns are today a postmodern fake. Does Donald Trump stand for traditional values? No, his conservatism is a postmodern performance, a gigantic ego trip. In this sense of playing with traditional values, of mixing references to them with open obscenities, Trump is the ultimate postmodern president. If we compare Trump with Bernie Sanders, Trump is
I
a
emphatically
postmodern
agree with that.
politician at its purest, while Sanders is rather an old-fashioned moralist. Conservative thinkers claim that the origin of our crisis is the loss of our reliance on some transcendent divinity or higher value. If we are left to ourselves, if everything is historically conditioned and relative, then there is nothing preventing us to indulge in our lowest tendencies. But is this really the lesson to be learned from mob killing, looting, and burning on behalf of religion? It is often claimed that, true or not, religion makes some otherwise bad people do good things. From today's experience, I think we should rather stick to Steve Weinberg's claim that while without religion, good people would have been doing good things and bad people bad things, only something like religion can make good people do bad things. More than a century ago, in his Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky warned against the dangers of godless moral nihilism. If God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted. The French philosopher André Glucksmann applied Dostoevsky's critique of godless nihilism to September 11th. And the title of his book, Dostoevsky in Manhattan, suggests, as this title suggests, he couldn't have been more wrong. The lesson of today's terrorism is that if there is a God, then everything, even blowing up hundreds of innocent bystanders, is permitted to those who claim to act directly on behalf of God. The same goes also for godless Stalinist communists. They are the ultimate proof of it. Everything was permitted to them since they perceived themselves as direct instrument of their divinity, of the historical necessity of progress towards communism. That's the big problem of ideologies. How to make good, decent people do horrible things. Second, yes, we should carry our burden, accept the suffering that goes with it. But a danger lurks here, that of a subtle reversal. Don't fall in love, that's my position, with your suffering. Never presume that your suffering is in itself a proof of your authenticity. Renunciation of pleasure can easily turn into pleasure of renunciation itself. For example, an example not from neoconservatives. White left liberals love to denigrate their own culture and blame Eurocentrism for our evils. But it is instantly clear how this self-denigration brings a profit of its own. Through this renouncing of their particular roots, multicultural liberals reserve for themselves the universal position, graciously soliciting others to assert their particular identity. White multiculturalist liberals embody the lie of identity politics. Next point. Jacques Lacan wrote something paradoxical but deeply true, that even if what a jealous husband claims about his wife, that she sleeps with other men, is all true, his jealousy is nonetheless pathological. The pathological element is the husband's need for jealousy, as the only way for him to sustain his identity. Along the same lines, one could say that even if most of the Nazi claims about Jews, they exploit Germans, they seduce German girls, and so on, were true, which they were not, of course, their anti-Semitism would still be a pathological phenomenon because it ignored the true reason why the Nazis needed anti-Semitism. In the Nazi vision, their society is an organic whole of harmonious collaboration, so an external intruder is needed to account for divisions and antagonisms. The same holds for how today, in Europe at least, the anti-immigrant populists deal with the refugees. The cause of problems which are, I claim, immanent to today's global capitalism is projected onto an external intruder. Again, even if the reported incident with the refugees, there are great problems, I admit it. Even all these reports are true. The populist story about them is a lie. With anti-Semitism, we are approaching the topic of telling stories. Hitler was one of the greatest storytellers of the 20th century. In the 1920s, many Germans experienced their situation as a confused mess. They didn't understand what is happening to them with military defeat, economic crisis, what they perceived as moral decay, and so on. Hitler provided a story, a plot, which was precisely that of a Jewish plot. We are in this mess because of the Jews. That's what I would like to insist on. We are telling ourselves stories about ourselves in order to acquire a meaningful experience of our lives. However, this is not enough. One of the most stupid wisdoms, and they are mostly stupid, is an enemy is someone whose story you have not heard. Really? Are you also ready to affirm that Hitler was our enemy because his story was not heard? The experience that we have of our lives from within, the story we tell ourselves about ourselves in order to account for what we are doing is, and this is what I call ideology, fundamentally a lie. The truth lies outside in what we do. In a similar way, the alt-right obsession with cultural Marxism expresses the rejection to confront the fact that the phenomena they criticize as the effect of the cultural Marxist plot, moral degradation, sexual promiscuity, consumerist hedonism, and so on, are the outcome of the immanent dynamic of capitalist societies. I would like to refer to a classic, Daniel Bell, Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, written back in 1976, where the author argues that the unbounded drive of modern capitalism undermines the moral foundations of the original Protestant ethics. And in a new afterword, Bell offers a bracing perspective on contemporary Western societies, revealing the crucial cultural fault lines we face as the 21st century is here. The turn towards culture as a key component of capitalist reproduction and concomitant to it, the commodification of cultural life itself, are, I think, crucial moments of capitalist expanded reproduction. So the term cultural Marxism, I think, plays the same role as that of the Jewish plot in anti-Semitism. It projects or transposes some immanent antagonism, however you call it, ambiguity, tension of our socio-economic life onto an external cause. In exactly the same way, now let me give you a different, more problematic example. In exactly the same way, liberal critics of Trump and alt-right never seriously asked how our liberal society could give birth to Trump. In this sense, the image of Donald Trump is also a fetish, the last thing a liberal sees before confronting actual social tensions. Hegel's motto, evil resides in the gaze which sees evil everywhere, fully applies here. The very liberal gaze which demonizes Trump is also evil because it ignores how its own failures open up the space for Trump's type of patriotic populism. Next point. One should stop blaming hedonist egotism for our woes. The true opposite of egotist self-love is not altruism, a concern for the common good, but envy, resentment, which makes me act against my own interests. This is why, as many perspicuous philosophers clearly saw, evil is profoundly spiritual, in some sense more spiritual than goodness. This is why egalitarianism itself should never be accepted at its face value. It can well secretly invert the standard renunciation accomplished to benefit others. Egalitarianism often de facto means I am ready to renounce something so that others will also not have it. This is, I think, now comes the problematic part for some of you, maybe the problem with political correctness. What appears as its excesses, its regulatory zeal, is, I think, an impotent reaction to that masks the
Do either of you remember his
reality.
Slovenian joke about this
hero
point?
is here a black
Oh, which one?
Oh, it's the one about the peasant and the genie.
Oh, with the is this what? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's one of my favorite ones where he makes this point where he says, you know, so there are two Slovene peasants. They're sitting there, they're farming, and one of them finds a magic lamp. They rub it, the genie comes out, and he says, okay, you know, a wish for both of you, naturally. And one of the, you know, and the second peasant is like, all right, I wish for, oh, fuck, I can't remember it. Actually, here, you go, Russ. Go ahead.
Okay, the way I remember it is that, right, there, isn't it that the genie says, whatever I do to you, I'll do twice as worse to the other person?
Oh, and yes, absolutely. And he says, take out one of my eyes. That's right.
Take one of my eyes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, by the way, our graphic designer, J. Andrew World, works very quickly, often during these things. And since there was a joke about it earlier, he whipped up this. So
look at that.
You know, just while we're paused, I mean, the approach is entirely different, right? So Peterson showed up having read, allegedly, the Communist Manifesto.
Skim.
And I mean, this annoyed a lot of people, right? Like Slavoj showed up and he doesn't even really, I mean, he engages Peterson like sort of just with like glancing blows every once in a while, right? Like with the, you know, cultural neo-Marxism, but postmodern neo-Marxism. But really what this, I mean, if you've watched enough and read enough, you know, watched enough clips of Slavoj or read enough of his stuff, this is like the greatest hits. So he's getting it. I mean, he's scoring sort of a lot of points here. And I think I was thinking while we were watching this that, you know, Ben, you were talking earlier about Peterson speaking in such a manner that it's almost like it's the authority, the seeming authority comes from the affected manner in which he says it. And then as soon as you sort of, you know, scratch a little bit beneath the surface, you know, you see that there's not much, it's fake profundity. Whereas like Žižek it is true. He's like bouncing from one thing to another, like a pinball. There are interconnections between them, but it's like any one of these you could, if you were to you would scratch the surface, you would have to keep going down further and further because each one of them is, you know, a whole book could be written on it. And so I think that part of it, and I think that is actually in and of itself kind of hypnotizing in a way, or sort of mesmerizing, and that to watch him sort of weave all these different threads together. And I think that part of that is, you know, what he said to us, that he wasn't so much interested in this, you know, him versus Peterson. I mean, that would just be a sort of, you know, a shallow ego contest. And it really is about, like, he's trying to speak, I think he's trying to condense so many different points of his own thought into this, you know, half-hour block that he has to try to appeal to those people who, you know, have fallen for Peterson, and to say, here's a leftist perspective, and also things are far more complicated and complex than Peterson is trying to, you know, tell you the answers are, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think actually he really makes that point with his critique of liberal identity politics, right? And this emphasis on victimization. And Žižek has written a lot about this, and I don't want to kind of rehash what he says, but I think quite often it's really observant, right? Where he says that absolutely we shouldn't be there denouncing victims or claiming that victims are weak or don't deserve sympathy, but it's a moral error to suppose that just because someone assumes that they're a victim or even are a victim, that they nonetheless have the correct view about what should be done. And in a recent, I think it was Telegraph piece, he said, look, the Nazis in the 1920s had very good reason to consider themselves victims of at least something, right? The Allies had mistreated Germany very badly at the end of the First World War. There was a Great Depression that was going on. There are plenty of reasons for Germans to be angry. That doesn't mean, as he points out, that the turn to Nazism wasn't pathological and evil. And I think you could apply something very similar to Trumpists today. Again, Wendy Brown did that recently in her great book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, where she says, look, plenty of people who voted for Trump might have legitimate grievances against the system that they're misdirecting. They're not targeting neoliberalism, they're targeting the vulnerable. But a lot of the people who support Trump actually are in positions of power right now. And the odd thing is that we're seeing exactly the opposite of what somebody like Nietzsche would predict, which is resentment of the weak towards the powerful. Instead, what we're seeing right now with a lot of Trumpists is resentment of the powerful towards the weak, which is something that he never would have predicted. Yeah. And it's really, I think, very in keeping with Slavoj's analysis, because these people do legitimately see themselves as victims, but they see themselves as victims precisely because their privileges and powers are being challenged by progressive movements.
Well, that's the irony of it, is that actually, like, right, for all that they want to talk about safe spaces. I mean, we could go on and on about this. We all know that this is, the claim to victimization is, what empowers the entire right movement now. That's why there's absolutely, even now, especially now after there's little to no policy behind this other than victimization and just sort of grievances.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to overemphasize the point too much here. Obviously, Trump supporters aren't Nazis, although there are all Nazis. There are Nazis amongst Trump supporters. But I think Corey Robin's analysis in The Reactionary Mind is really good here, where he points out that a lot of people on the left have misunderstood what the political right is about, because they assume that since the political right disdains victim culture so much that they would never want to present themselves as victims. But Robin points out that in many ways, since conservatism is the voice of the powerful, trying to resist his power being taken away, there are a lot of reasons conservatives can see themselves as victims, because they had something like a privilege. And we want not necessarily to take it away, but to universalize or generalize the entitlements to that privilege.
Conservatives have been, as long as there's been conservatism, essentially, there's been conservative victimhood narratives. I mean, just read read Edmund Burke, waxing poetic about the martyrdom of Marie Antoinette.
I was just gonna say the Marie Antoinette section of of Reflections on the Revolution. Yeah. Which which is just really embarrassing, simping, that she's the most amazing woman who's ever lived, and it's just this and just imagine these callous people, these brutes, mistreating her. So I
think that was the first point in European philosophy, actually, where I saw some reference to the Cole's "chivalry is dead" thesis. Since that's basically what he says in that paragraph, right? I would have thought 1,000 swords would have leapt to defend her honor, and then everyone was silent. Chivalry is dead.
It's actually, for Peterson, he could only wish that he could write something as poetic as that. For as politically averse I am to it, it's an amazing passage.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, and of course, I mean, the core, the point you were talking about with Žižek earlier is clearly the right one, that seeing yourself as a victim, or in some sense being a victim, right, by itself doesn't tell us anything, right? I mean, the question is whether you were, the first question is whether you were victimized unjustly, which just has to be evaluated on its merits, just sort of speaking as a victim doesn't tell us anything about that, right? If you I'm sure that the people in the real life equivalent of the Gone with the Wind scenario, with like losing their plantations and stuff. Like, yeah, in some sense they were, the victims of changing circumstances. That doesn't mean that they were unjustly victimized. And it certainly doesn't mean that you have any particular like insight that others should defer to about why about why it is that you're victimized, about what should be done about your victimization, and this I think is like part of what I take Žižek to be criticizing. When he's talking about like politically correct liberalism, that is this kind of because this kind of like what Matt Brunig calls identitarian deference, is a big part of that kind of of liberalism. That it's that you should just like shut up and listen when somebody starts a sentence with as a, right, speaking
Right.
as a,
Right.
and I think, and yeah, as you say, Russ, I mean, this goes back to what we were talking about. We were talking to the man himself about on last weekend, because a big part of what he was what he was doing here. I mean, like, yeah, he does land. I mean, already, right? He has landed some real blows. I mean, I think that thing about that comparison about postmodern Marxism and neo-Marxism and cultural Marxism and anti-Semitism. I think that's more than glancing. But so he definitely lands some real blows. But like also, his agenda isn't just to sort of engage with what Peterson's saying. His agenda is to engage with the audience, to engage with the people who, like the just like confused young guys who aren't necessarily hardened reactionaries who follow Peterson, and so I think this kind of signaling is actually incredibly useful for that. Like, yeah, the stuff that annoys you about like the campus left annoys me too. That's okay, right? You don't actually your choices are not that or Jordan Peterson. You can be a radical leftist, without actually buying into all of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I just wanted to caution against overinterpreting his thesis here, because I know there are some Marxists in particular who see Žižek as a scathing critic of identity politics, and just think that he has no kind of redeeming things to say about it. And I'm not sure that that's what he's really getting for. Obviously, he's not saying we shouldn't be pro-feminist, pro-racial equality, pro-trans rights.
Right. I mean, he explicitly says that at before he makes his point. Like, so he'll say like LGBT plus ideology, but before that, he goes out of his way to say, of course, I fully support LGBTQ rights, and it's not a throwaway. I mean, he's thinking about these things. He's thinking about very careful way. Very careful way.
No, for sure. I mean, look, I think that, and yeah, I take Matt's point and the point. I think this is actually true of most left critics of all of that. That like another example, would be Angela Nagel, who's somebody I don't always agree with.
That's for sure.
I strongly disagreed with her immigration article a couple of years ago, and said so at the time. Although I also said that I don't think she should be like, that you should conclude that she's like secretly become a right winger or extricator thing. Like, you can just have a bad take, and and that can be that, right? But in other places, though, I think that she's actually struck this balance in exactly the right way. I've always really liked this from an article with Vox, an interview with Vox, when her book Kill All Normies came out, and she was asked this question about identity politics, and she says, I think parts of the left have confused my attempts to criticize the identity-based internet subculture with all identity politics, and that's not true. Identity politics gave us the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, civil rights movement, and so on. It'd be absurd to conflate that entire radical history with a small internet subculture. What I criticized wasn't identity politics in general, but a specific version of identity politics that was about performative wokeness. And in particular, the reason I don't like that is because people were very inclined to censor, and it was very inclined to gang up on people. I hate that, and I think it deserves to be criticized. And I think from my perspective at least, I think that's very well said. I mean, that's the distinction you have to make, because look, if what you mean is should we have should we rigorously stamp out discrimination on all those categories? Of course we should. If what you mean is should we reject prejudice and bigotry in all these categories? Of course we should. If what you mean is should we go beyond just sort of formally rejecting and have things like affirmative action to make sure it's really meaningfully stamped out, then yes, of course we should. But if what you mean is the particular, cultural politics of one side of the culture war right now, I think there are good reasons from a left perspective to reject that too.
Yeah, and I think he does a great job. And I'm saying this partly tooting my own horn here as the postmodern conservatism guy. But I think he does a great job actually redirecting the narrative to suggest how it is that a kind of resentment-based identity politics can be very appealing to people on the political right, and how it can take on very strong postmodern connotations. I mean, I often come back to 2004 and point out that Karl Rove is the one who talked about the so-called reality-based community, and how as an empire, the United States creates its own reality now. So there are deep roots to these kind of postmodern tendencies in the conservative movement in the United States. And I would argue that if you look back far enough in the conservative tradition, a lot of it has been about identity, whether we're talking about national identity, ethnic identity, racial identity, particularly in the American South and Germany, right? So redirecting our attention in that way, I think or the audience's attention, is I think a very clever way of getting people in the audience who might be sympathetic to Peterson to think about things differently.
Yeah, you don't like postmodernism. I've got some postmodernism for you.
Yeah. I mean, we're not the ones who are sitting there saying, we have alternative facts to offer you.
Right. Exactly.
Black lady Tarana Burke, who created the Me Too campaign more than a decade ago. She observed in a recent critical note that in the years since the movement began, it deployed an unwavering obsession with the perpetrators. Me Too is all too often a genuine protest filtered through resentment. Should we then drop egalitarianism? No. Equality can also mean, and that's the equality I advocate, creating the space for as many as possible individuals to develop their different potentials. It is, that's my paradoxical claim, it is today's capitalism that equalizes us too much and causes the loss of many talents.
Ben, I think you got to mute yourself to prevent the echo.
Equality and hierarchy. Did we really move too much in the direction of equality? Is there in today's United States really too much equality? I think a simple overview of the situation points in the opposite direction. Far from pushing us too far, the left is gradually losing its ground already for decades. Its trademarks, universal healthcare, free education, and so on, are continuously diminished. Look at Bernie Sanders, and I don't idealize him, program. It is just a version of what half a century ago in Europe was simply the predominant social democracy, and it's today decried as a threat to our freedoms, to the American way of life, and so on and so on. I see no threat to free creativity in this program. On the contrary, I see healthcare and education and so on as enabling me to focus my life on more important creative issues. I see equality, this basic equality of chances, as a space for creating differences, and yes, why not, different, more appropriate hierarchies. Furthermore, I find it very hard to ground today's inequalities as they are documented, for example, by Piketty in his book, on to ground today's inequalities in different competencies. Competencies for what? In totalitarian states, competencies are determined politically. But market success is also not innocent and neutral as a regulator of the social recognition of competencies. Let me now briefly deal with a in a friendly way, I claim, with what became known, sorry for the irony, as the lobster topic. I'm far from a simple social constructionism here. I deeply appreciate evolutionary thought. Of course, we are also natural beings, and our DNA, as we all know, overlaps, I may be wrong, around 98% with that of some monkeys. This means something. But nature, I think we should never forget this, is not a stable hierarchical system, but full of improvisations. It develops like French cuisine. A French guy gave me this idea that the origin of many famous French dishes or drinks is that when they wanted to produce a standard piece of food or drink, something went wrong, but then they realized that this failure can be resold as success. They were making cheese in the usual way, but the cheese got rotten and infected, smelling bad, and they said, oh my God, look, we have our own original French cheese. Or they were making wine in the usual way. Then something went wrong with fermentations, and so they began to produce champagne and so on and so on. I'm not making just a joke here because I think that it is exactly like this that, and that's the lesson of psychoanalysis, that our sexuality works. Sexual instincts are, of course, biologically determined. But look what we humans made out of them. They are not limited to the mating season. They can develop into a permanent obsession, sustained by obstacles that demand to be overcome. In short, into a properly metaphysical passion that perturbs the biological rhythm, with twists like endlessly prolonging satisfaction in courtly love, engaging in different perversions, and so on and so on. So it's still, yes, biologically conditioned sexuality, but it is, if I may use this term, trans-functionalized. It becomes a moment of a different cultural, however you call it, logic. And I claim the same goes for tradition. T.S. Eliot, the great conservative, wrote, quote, what happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the work of art which preceded it. The past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. End of quote. What does this mean? Let me mention the change enacted by Christianity. It's not just that, in spite of all our natural and cultural differences, the same divine spark dwells in everyone. But this divine spark enables us to create what Christians call Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit, a community in which hierarchic family values are at some level at least abolished. Remember Paul's words from Galatians. There is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer male and female in Christ. A democracy extends this logic to the political space. In spite of all differences in competence, the ultimate decision should stay with all of us. The wager of democracy is that we should not give all power to competent experts. It was precisely communists in power who legitimized their rule by posing as fake experts. And incidentally, I'm far from believing in ordinary people's wisdom. We often need a master figure to push us out of an inertia. And I'm not afraid to say that forces us to be free. Freedom and responsibility hurt. They require an effort. And the highest function of an authentic master is to literally to awaken us to our freedom. We are not spontaneously really free. Furthermore, think I think that social power and authority cannot be directly grounded in competence. In our human universe, power, in the sense of exerting authority, is something much more mysterious, even irrational. Kierkegaard, my and everybody's favorite theologist, wrote, if a child says he will obey his father because his father is a competent and good guy, this is an affront to father's authority. And he applied the same logic to Christ himself. Christ was justified by the fact of being God's son, not by his competencies or capacities. As Kierkegaard put it, every good student of theology can put things better than Christ. There is no such authority in nature. Lobsters may have hierarchy, undoubtedly, but the main guy among them, I don't think he has authority in this sense. Again, the wager of democracy is that, and that's the subtle thing, not against competence and so on, but that political power and competence or expertise should be kept apart. In Stalinism, precisely, they were not kept apart, while already in ancient Greece, they knew that they have to be kept apart, which is why their popular weight was even combined with lottery often. So where does communism, just to conclude, where does communism enter here? Why do I still cling to this cursed name when I know and fully admit the 20th century communist project in all its failure, how it failed giving birth to new forms of murderous terror? Capitalism won, but today, and that's my claim, we can debate about it. The question is, does today's global capitalism contain strong enough antagonisms which prevent its indefinite reproduction? I think there are such antagonisms. The threat of ecological catastrophe, the consequence of new techno-scientific developments, especially in biogenetics, and new forms of apartheid. All these antagonisms concern what Marx called commons, the shared substance of our social being. First, of course, the commons of external nature, threatened by pollution, global warming, and so on. Now, let me be precise here. I'm well aware how uncertain analysis and projections are in this domain. It will be certain only when it will be too late. And I am well aware of the temptation to engage in precipitous extrapolations. When I was younger, to give you a critical example, there was in Germany an obsession with Waldsterben, the dying of forests, with predictions that in a couple of decades, Europe will be without forests. But according to recent estimates, there are now more forests in Europe than 100 years or 50 years ago. But there is nonetheless, I claim, the prospect of a catastrophe here. Scientific data seem to me at least abundant enough. And we should act in a large-scale collective way. And I also think, this may be critical to some of you, there is a problem with capitalism here for the simple reason that its managers, not because of their evil nature, but that's the logic of capitalism, care to expand self-reproduction, and environmental consequences are simply not part of the game. This is, again, not a moral reproach. And incidentally, so that you will not think that I don't know what I'm talking about, in communist countries, those in power were obsessed with expanded reproduction and were not under public control, so the situation was even worse. So how to act? First, by admitting we are in a deep mess. There is no simple democratic solution here. The idea that people themselves should decide what to do about ecology sounds deep, but it begs an important question, even if their comprehension is not distorted by corporate interests. What qualifies them to pass a judgment in such a delicate matter? Plus, the radical measures advocated by some ecologists can themselves trigger new catastrophes. Let me mention just the idea which is floating around of solar radiation management, the continuous massive dispersal of aerosols into our atmosphere to reflect and absorb sunlight and thus cool the planet. Can we even imagine how the fragile balance of our Earth function and in what unpredictable ways geoengineering can be arbit in such times of urgency when we know we have to act but don't know how to act? Thinking is needed. Maybe we should turn around a little bit. Marx's famous Thesis 11. in our new century, we should say that maybe in the last century, we tried all too fast to change the world. The time has come to step back and interpret it. The second threat, the commons of internal nature. With new biogenetic technologies, the creation of a new man in the literal sense of changing human nature becomes a realist prospect. I mean primarily so-called popularly neural link, the direct link between our brain and digital machines, and then brains among themselves. This, I think, is the true game changer. The digitalization of our brain opens up unheard of new possibilities of control. Directly sharing your experience with your beloved may appear attractive, but what about sharing them with an agency without you even knowing it? Finally, the common space of humanity itself. We live in one and the same world, which is more and more interconnected, but nonetheless deeply divided. So, how to react to this? The first and sadly predominant reaction is the one of protective self enclosure. The world out there is in a mess. Let's protect ourselves by all kinds of walls. It seems that our countries are run relatively well, but is the mess the so-called rogue countries find themselves in not connected to how we interact with them? Take what is perhaps the ultimate rogue state, Congo. Warlords who rule provinces there are always dealing with Western companies, selling them minerals. Where would our computers be without coltan from Congo? And what about foreign interventions in Iraq and Syria, or by our proxies like Saudi Arabia in Yemen? Here, refugees are created. A new world order is emerging, a world of, can I just finish the page? 2 minutes, literally. A world of peaceful coexistence of civilizations, but in what way does it function? Forced marriages and homophobia are okay, just that they are limited to another country, which is otherwise fully included into the world market. This is how refugees, again, are created. The second reaction is global capitalism with the human face. Think about socially responsible corporate figures like Bill Gates or George Soros. They passionately support LGBT, they advocate charities, and so on. But even in its extreme form, opening up our borders to the refugees, treating them like one of us, they only provide what in medicine is called a symptomatic treatment. The solution is not for the rich Western countries to receive all immigrants, but somehow to try to change the situation, which creates massive waves of immigration. And we are complicit in this. Is such a change a utopia? No. The true utopia is that we can survive without such a change. So here I think, I know it's provocative to call this a plea for communism. I do it a little bit to provoke things. But what is needed is nonetheless in all these spheres, I claim, ecology, digital control, unity of the world, capitalist market, which does great things, I admit it, has to be somehow limited, regulated, and so on. Before you say it's a utopia, I will tell you, but just think about in what way global market already functions today. I always thought that neoliberalism is a fake term. If you look closely, you will see that state plays today more important role than ever precisely in the richest capitalist economies. So, the market is already limited, but not in the right way to put naively. So, a pessimist conclusion. What will happen? In spite of protests here and there, we will probably continue to slide towards some kind of apocalypse, awaiting large catastrophes to awaken us. So I don't accept any cheap optimism. When somebody tries to convince me that in spite of all the problems, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, my instant reply is yes. And it's probably another train coming towards us. Thank you very much.
That was a good way to end.
Yeah, what's the last maybe 8 minutes of his opening statement there, where he basically was explaining the issues and antagonisms that are facing us that are much of the reason why he wants to maintain the signifier communism. And I just thought of this because we're actually, I don't know when it's going to happen, probably hopefully sometime next year, but we're in the beginning stages of trying to plan another. There's a series of books that have been published by Verso collections called The Idea of Communism that Slavoj has participated in. So we're going to try to do another one of those, and each one of them was held in a location. So there's like the New York conference, there's the Seoul conference, and I don't know where we're going to do this, but it might be the COVID conference, because I just wanted to say, one, listening to this in light of COVID, how much more prescient the things that he was saying were, even though he left out one of the, he mentions ecology, biogenetics, the refugee crisis. One of the things that he always mentions in that list of antagonisms that are going to, problems that we're going to face, that he didn't mention here is intellectual property, which, obviously would have been perfect, especially given, what the move that the Biden administration just made to open up, waive the intellectual, property claims on the vaccines. So, yeah, I just wanted to mention that, but also that, again, the idea that what he's talking about, it's actually more sort of future oriented far more than Peterson's. Like let's go back and read the Communist Manifesto poorly. So I just think in terms of what would resonate with the audience more, I think this is another way to sort of pick off some Petersonites, right? Like, let's actually let's not talk about, postmodern neo-Marx. Let's talk about some actual problems that we're going to face, within the next, over the next decade.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to say one thing, as somebody who uses the term neoliberalism. I think recent research has shown that actually from the very beginning, the neoliberals were very cognizant of the fact that they would need a strong state in order to enact the kind of economic reforms that they wanted to see. I mean, the kind of thesis of Hayek's main book, The Constitution of Liberty, and its sequel, Legislation and Liberty, isn't freedom from the state. It's freedom through law, and neoliberal law in particular, right? And he was very overt about the fact that if it came down to it, if you wanted to have a liberal authoritarian regime or socialist democratic regime, then the liberal authoritarian regime was the one that you should go with, which is why he supported Pinochet, right? So
which by the way, is like something
just to defend the use of that term.
Yeah, people really like to, libertarians really like to play that down. Well, actually, what they really like to do is focus on Friedman's support for Pinochet instead, because they think they have a better defense of that. They could say, oh, he just came down and gave him an hour of economic advice. Why are you guys making a big deal about this? Also sent a gushing letter about Pinochet's hospitality and how it was great to see Chile finally back in the right direction. But the Friedman Pinochet connection is nothing next to the Hayek Pinochet connection.
Yeah.
That Hayek extensively defended, Pinochet and the coup. And yeah, I mean, this is not even Hayek being inconsistent with his principles. This is Hayek applying his principles in the Constitution of Liberty. He has a chapter on state of exception, temporary dictatorship to protect economic liberty. And it was such a love fest on both sides. I think that Hayek actually called his Chilean constitution the Constitution of Liberty, as a nod to that connection. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, there's also Mark Fisher's point that contrary to what you might superficially think, the rise of neoliberalism has actually resulted in a lot more paperwork and bureaucracy, because you're one of the hallmarks of neoliberalism is means testing, right? Instead of just giving everybody things just for being a person, just for being part of the social order, there's all this elaborate bureaucratic state mechanism going into deciding whether somebody actually deserves help or not. So yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, one of the things that Quinn Slobodian points out, and also a number of contemporary theorists, like Jessica White. I think her book, The Morals of the Market, is really good on this, is that the neoliberals weren't even content with state control. They were one of the first to really put forward this idea that we need a robust international economic legal system that's going to enforce property rights around the globe, whether or not states, particularly democratic states, want it, which is why you see things like the IMF and the World Bank becoming empowered, the WTO being founded in the 1990s precisely to kind of enact this agenda, backed up by the imperial power of the Washington Consensus and U.S. military might. But like one of the things I wanted to point out with Žižek's point, because I think this is really interesting, is he talks a little bit about his vision of nature, and he contrasts that implicitly with Peterson's vision of nature. And I think this is a really good point to elaborate on some of the different ways that progressives and conservatives, broadly speaking, conceptualize nature. Peterson, whether he acknowledges it or not, I think is really attached to an old Aristotelian vision of how it is that nature operates. Obviously, he himself is not specifically Aristotelian, but the kind of broad strokes of there being an ordered universe where everything has its place. And ultimately, there are natural inequalities that emerge, and these are beneficial as long as they're respected. And the only reason why it is that this harmonious universe falls apart in a certain fundamental way is because of the presence of immoralism, decadence, or unvirtuous behavior, right? Which I think has often been used and appealed to as a justification for inequality, since, of course, certain kinds of unvirtuous behavior include not knowing your place, not doing what you're told, and not doing what you're supposed to within the greater social whole. And I think progressives, as laid out by Žižek, see the world very differently, right? We see the world in materialist terms as matter. Certainly, we have to obey physical laws, but what's important to stress when you understand the world in materialist terms is our freedom to interpret and reinterpret it in line with our own humanistic objectives, right? So that means that we shouldn't just take a look at society and say it's an organic whole, everything has its place, and the only reason why bad things will occur is because people don't understand the natural role they're meant to play. We need to create space for everyone, as Žižek points out, to use their human capabilities to interpret the world and to try to bring about a social order that's more conducive to the kind of human flourishing and freedom that would be compatible with our deep-seated humanist values. And I think there are two very different ways of conceptualizing how it is that nature operates. And I don't want to get too much into it, because we'll be here forever. But it's interesting that he links this back to the Christian myth, because I think that's absolutely right. A lot of conservative Christians actually are more Aristotelian than Christian. And this is something that he references with the Kierkegaard point as well, where you'll see a lot of conservatives argue for Christianity by saying we need to defend Christian civilization and the social order that creates. Whereas I think Kierkegaard was absolutely right, where he said nothing could be more contrary to the liberationist spirit of Christianity than the idea of a Christian civilization or Christian society, right? Because if you are genuinely a Christian, what you should want isn't a Christian society, but to make the way to genuine faith a lot harder, so that's a truly free act to dedicate yourself to that. Which is why I think in many ways, Žižek, as he sometimes points it out, is a much more devout follower of our Judeo-Christian heritage than someone like Jordan Peterson is, who is really in many ways a pagan thinker, just to be, a little cheeky.
Yeah, well, which Žižek's kind of like is also being a little cheeky, pointing that out. I think in the when he was quoting the New Testament in his opening statement, neither Jew nor Greek, all that stuff. Like, that passage is pretty different from even lobsters have hierarchies, don't mess with it.
It's very true.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to Matt's point about Peterson's sort of view of nature, and to contrast it even more with Žižek's. I think we were talking about this last week, that Slavoj's section in Examine Life, the Astra Taylor film, which
that was a good film. Yeah.
Cornel West is in it, Judith Butler, Avital Ronell, Kwame Anthony Appiah, Michael Hart, et cetera, et cetera. But Slavoj is seen as in a garbage dump in London, and he's critiquing. It's interesting
coming through the porn, right?
And he critiques ecology. He says ecology is going to become the new ideology of the 21st century, and he's actually critiquing not a rightist view, but actually more so like a sort of like left liberal view of ecology. And he says this narrative that we have, and it's like this sort of new agey view that nature was this harmonious totality that then mankind through its hubris, disrupted and upset. And he's like, I can't think of a stupider, more like scientifically incorrect view of Mother Nature. Like Mother Nature is cruel. I mean, we have signs all over the place. They're called fossils that Mother Nature is not. Mother Nature is not a harmonious totality. I mean, what do we use in order to now like kill the planet? Well, we use fossil fuels. Where do those come from? Those are like signs of the Earth being destroyed before like previous civilizations. So don't tell me that nature was this harmonious totality and it's only mankind through its hubris that has upended this very delicate equilibrium.
Which reminds me, I've got to say, Matt, I've got I'm kind of mad at Matt right now because he's making me read this book by Jason Brennan called Libertarianism, What Everyone Needs to Know, to talk about it on Plastic Pills.
You need to share the burden, Ben.
And in that book, there's this passage. It's just like a couple sentences, but like it made me so fucking angry when I read it. Where the thing about nature as a harmonious whole, was put me in mind of it. And of course, since Peterson's whole thing when he's defending capitalist hierarchy is by analogies to nature. I think that also reminded me of it. Let me just read it out here. It says, Brennan writes, society and the market are like ecosystems. And like ecosystems, they are impossible to manage without unintended consequences. Governments thus tend to make problems worse, not better. Which, just as a pedantic logic nerd, that thus drives me crazy. It's like the first sentence doesn't give you any reason to believe the second one. Yes, unintended consequences exist as well as intended ones for any human decision. It does not at all follow from that government intervention in markets, makes things worse. But also, look, take the metaphor seriously. Like, do you really think it's better to just let ecosystems play out, without any form of intervention? Like, I'm pretty sure that's the kind of life that gets you is nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah, I mean, it's also there's a classic just in those, what is it, 2 sentences, Ben? Like, there's also the classic move to naturalize economy, right? Like, it's like, exactly, yeah. The free market is just like nature. Ergo, how dare you question the free market? Because if you question the free market, you're questioning nature itself, right? I mean, that's the pure. What's the irony of that is that, I mean, you can ascribe, I think, that position to Peterson as well. Is that I think I'm stealing this from somebody else, but somebody said like Peterson is awash in ideology, but Peterson has no theory of ideology, which I think is why, hierarchies, capitalism, markets, all of these things can just be naturalized for him because it's the old sort of A equals A. He's so thoroughly and I'm not saying Žižek has an ideology. I'm not saying that Žižek is outside of ideology, but he very clearly aligns, and says what his ideology is. The idea I think that Peterson is trying to palm off is that these crazy leftists or crazy Marxists, they think that they're not ideological, but they're really awash in ideology. And what I'm telling you is the gospel truth and is outside. I'm ideology. I'm post-ideological.
Yeah, right. And yeah, I mean, also, which, the first step is admitting you have a problem, and ideology is a problem we all have. So, there you go. But it's also, I think, yeah, I mean, I'm just still thinking about this thing about ecosystems because it's like, okay, really, really run with the analogy, right? Should we not intervene in ecosystems because that has unintended consequences? Like, is agriculture bad? Right? I mean, agriculture is certainly a pretty massive intervention in the natural world. We could just be hunter gatherers. Is medicine bad? Medicine is like an extreme, human intervention in the natural world. Of course, all these things do have unintended consequences. Life is complicated, but overall, there's certainly net benefits.
Yeah, well, that just from Matt really quickly, because I was just going to link this back to something that you said last week, which is the sort of typical conservative move that, look, fill in the blank system is so complex and so complicated that we couldn't possibly fully comprehend it. And I think there's a similar move going on that, like, look, this system is so complex that it's like a Jenga square. If you pull one block out, if we're interrogating anything, the whole thing is going to collapse. Ergo, just keep the status quo. Don't do anything.
Yeah. And Peterson makes this very express in Maps of Meaning, where in an early passage he says, order is explored territory. That's the hundreds of millions year old hierarchy of place, position, and authority, the flag of the nation. And then he gives a number of other semi-poetic examples. But I mean, what we're saying about capitalism could apply, I think, very easily to any number of other conservative tropes as well. Take, for instance, resurgent nationalism right now. Particularly in the United States, nationalism is usually phrased, particularly right-wing nationalism, in opposition to a certain kind of federal intervention, right? And you see that with the Tea Party movement, Trumpism, this opposition to the big state. But one of the things that people like Benedict Anderson have pointed out for a long time is you don't have some concept of the nation emerging unless you have a state that's going to construct that conception for the people in the first place. And there's just replete examples of this historically. Take France, for example, which is usually held up as an exemplar of the nation state gone bad by many right-wing commentators. France had to enact horrible campaigns of discrimination to eliminate all the dialects within France. In order to produce a uniform French language. It took hundreds of years.
I mean, before the French Revolution, like, I think this is something that's like, actually, once you learn this, wrap your mind around, it's like really weird to think about. Like, like in pre-revolutionary France, not like, there's a language called French and there's a language called Italian. It's that, like, as you sort of move from Paris to Rome, the local dialect gets a little bit closer and a little bit closer and a little bit closer, to what they're speaking in the other one. So of course it has to be created. And back to to the Brennan point and also to Peterson point, the exact same thing applies to markets. I mean, markets are a result of state intervention in the economy. I mean, good luck having a market without state-backed currency, without limited liability corporations, without intellectual property laws, or
without protect for property rights.
Yeah, without state security forces to protect property rights. The police and the military, or for that matter, I mean, just try to imagine, like, look, trains are pretty important, historically to industrial development. Try to imagine trains coming into existence without some sort of state power with eminent domain rights, and like try to imagine what those train routes would look like every time you get to a farmer who doesn't want to sell.
I mean, Ben, the some of these libertarian debates with Sam Cedar you're going to be talking about, I'm sure those libertarians they've got ideas about how to make a train without the government. I don't want to get us too far off topic, but I just I'm pretty hyped for that episode just because I watch all those old clips. But yeah, it's ridiculous.
Well, I think this is actually where we can talk a little bit about where Žižek is very useful in unmasking some of these ideological conceits. Because I've often thought to myself, what's so problematic about things like the 1619 Project to conservatives, right? I mean, a lot of the stuff that they're talking about objectively happened. The United States was a slave-owning society. There's no such thing as a nation that's not created in some sense by state authority. Why is it problematic to point these things out? And I think the reason is that we move from this idea of there being an orderly, good universe where there are kind of natural forms of social organization, like nations, like market organizations, to one where we have to think about the universe in materialist terms. It's messy, it's complex, and a lot of times powerful figures have tried to impose their vision of how things should be onto material reality. But of course, if they've imposed their vision on material reality, then it's possible for us to challenge that and to try to impose our own and a better one. And that's precisely why it is that these kind of ideologically unmasking efforts are so dangerous, because removing the veil from these naturalization and mythologization efforts demonstrates, as Marx would put it, that we don't just have to interpret the world or understand the Aristotelian universe, we can change the world. right?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, Matt was a couple days ago came into guest lecture for my class at the School for Social and Cultural Change, and pointed out something very similar there. Very well about like how to the extent that like why it's so dangerous for these guys to admit that like property is something that like comes about as a result of social institutions and say power, because if it's not just something that we find like growing out of the ground, that like it's that if if your best sort of considered reflective case for property rights is about like how is about like how it's like established by a social contract or something, then like that obviously opens the door to the majority of us deciding that we want to renegotiate the social contract and and have something else, and you need a better answer that's not just like, oh, we have a natural right to exactly what we can get as a result of these like really specific legal and social mechanisms. So, all right, let's watch a few. I know we've got to wrap up part 2 in pretty soon. There will be a part 3, but let's.
I'm kind of happy this is a trilogy now, though. I've always wanted to be part of a trilogy of something. So it's the trio of Peterson Žižek debate takedowns.
Exactly. All right. Well, let's watch a few more minutes before we wrap up for tonight.
Please don't do this, because I really think that's why I hope you, Jordan, agree with it, that's why we are here engaged in this debate. Don't take it as a cheap competition. It may be that, but we are, as you said in your introduction, desperately trying to confront serious problems. I mean, for example, when I mentioned China, I didn't mean to celebrate it. That worries me terribly. My God, is this our future?
No.
Sorry for this. Sorry, please. Discount, take away this from my 10 minutes.
No problem. No problem. Dr. Peterson, 10 minutes to you to reply.
So I like to speak extemporaneously, but Dr. Žižek's discussion was so complex that there's no way that I can juggle my responses spontaneously. So, okay, yeah, well, and achievement managed, I would say. So I heard much of what I heard. I agreed with, but we can get to that. I'm going to respond.
Keep that. Pull out the knife.
All right. Well, I heard a criticism of capitalism, but no real support of Marxism. And that's an interesting thing, because for me, the terms of the argument were, well, there were 3 terms of the argument, let's say. There was capitalism, there was Marxism, and there was happiness. And I would say Dr. Žižek focused probably more on the problems of capitalism and the problems of happiness than on the utility of Marxism. And that actually comes as a surprise to me, because I presumed that much of what I would hear would be a support of something approximating traditional or even a-traditional Marxism, which is why I organized the first part of my talk as an attack against Marxism per se. Okay, so now Žižek points out that there are problems of capitalism. And I would like to say that I'm perfectly aware that there are problems with capitalism. I wasn't defending capitalism, actually, in some sense. I was defending it in comparison to communism, which is not the same thing. Because as Winston Churchill said about democracy, it's the worst form of government there is, except for all the other forms. And so you might say the same thing about capitalism, is that it's the worst form of economic arrangement you could possibly manage, except for every other one that we've ever tried. And I'm dead serious about that. I'm not trying to be flippant. I mean that it isn't obvious to me, when Dr. Žižek is speaking in more apocalyptic terms, it isn't obvious to me that we can solve the problems that confront us. And it's not a message that I have been purveying, that unbridled capitalism per se as an isolated, what would you say, social economic structure actually constitutes the proper answer to the problems that confront us. So I haven't made that case in any of the lectures that anything I've written or any of the lectures that I've done, because I don't believe it to be true. He said, well, what's the problems with capitalism? Well, the commodification of cultural life, all life, fair enough. There's something that isn't exactly right about reducing everything to economic competition. And capitalism certainly pushes in that direction. Advertising culture pushes in that direction. Sales and marketing culture pushes in that direction. And there's reasons for that. And I have a certain amount of admiration for the necessity of advertisers and salesmen and marketers. But that doesn't mean that the transformation of all elements of life into commodities in a capitalist sense is the best way forward. I don't think it is the best way forward. I think the evidence for that's actually quite clear. There is, by the way, a relationship. This is something I didn't point out before. There is a relationship between wealth and happiness. It's quite well defined in the psychological literature. Now, it's not exactly obvious whether the happiness measures are measures of happiness or whether they're measures of the absence of misery. And my sense is, as a psychometrician who's looked at these scales, that people are more concerned with not being miserable than they are with being happy. And those are all actually separate emotional states mediated by different psychobiological systems. It's a technical point, but it's an important one. There is a relationship between absolute level of income and self-reported lack of misery or happiness. And it's pretty linear until you hit, I would say, something approximating decent working class income. And so what seems to happen is that wealth makes you happy as long as it keeps the bill collectors at bay. Like once you've got to the point where the misery is staved off as much as it can be by the fact that you're not in absolutely economically dire straits, then adding more money to your life has no relationship whatsoever to your well-being. And so it's clear that past a certain minimal point, additional material provision is not sufficient to, let's say, redeem us individually or socially. And it's certainly the case that the radical wealth production that characterizes capitalism might produce a fatal threat to the structure of our social systems and our broader ecosystems. Who knows? I'm not absolutely convinced of that for a variety of reasons. I mean, Žižek pointed out, for example, that there are more forests in Europe now than there were 100 years ago. There's actually more forests in the entire northern hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. And the news on the ecological front is not as dismal as the people who put out the most dismal news would have you think. And there is some possibility. That doesn't mean that there aren't elements of it that are dismal. You know, what we've done to the oceans is definitely something catastrophic, and we definitely have our problems. But it is possible that human ingenuity might solve that. What else? There are inequalities generated by capitalism, a proclivity towards a shallow materialism, the probability of corruption. The thing about that for me is those are catastrophes that are part of the struggle for human existence itself and not something to be laid at the feet of any given socio-political system, especially one that seems to be producing a fair modicum of wealth for the poorest section of the population and raising people up to the point where, you know, their lives aren't an unending day-to-day struggle for mere survival. There's some evidence, for example, that if you can get GDP up to about $5,000 per person per year, oh, that's GDP, that people start to become concerned about environmental degradation and start to take actions to prevent it. And so there is some possibility that if we're lucky, we can get the bottom billion or 2 billion people in the world, or 3 billion, as the population grows, up to the point where they're wealthy enough so they actually start to care enough about the environment so that we could act collectively to solve environmental problems. Now, you might say, well, by that time we'll be out of Earth. You know, we'll have exhausted the resources that are in front of us so desperately that there's no hope of that. But I would like to remind you of a famous bet between Julian Simon and the biologist at Stanford who wrote, Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb. They bet, Ehrlich, who thought we were going to be overpopulated by the year 2000, bet Simon that by the year 2000, commodity prices would have increased dramatically as a consequence of evidence that we were running out of material resources. They made a famous bet over a 25-year period, and Ehrlich paid off Simon in the year 2000 because commodity prices went down and not up. And so there is no solid evidence that the fact that our population is growing and will peak out, by the way, at about 9 billion, there's no solid indication that the consequence of that is that we are in fact running out of necessary material resources. And so it's a danger, but it's not a danger that's proven. And there is some utility in considering that the addition of several billion more brains to the planet, especially if they were well-nourished brains, as they increasingly are, might help us generate enough problem solvers so that we can stay ahead of the looming ecological catastrophe as our population balloons outwards. Now, we're going to peak at 9 billion. It's not much higher than we are now, and it looks like we might be able to manage it. The other thing is that I didn't hear an alternative really from Dr. Žižek. You know, he admitted that the rise to success of the Chinese was in part a consequence of the allowance of market forces, and decried the authoritarian tendencies, and fair enough, that's exactly it. It also seemed to me that the social justice group identity processes that Dr. Žižek was decrying are, to me, a logical derivation from the oppression narrative that's a fundamental presupposition of Marxism. So there, I never heard a defense of Marxism in that part of his argument as well. And so for me, again, it's to ask, what's the alternative? I also heard an argument for egalitarianism, but I heard it defined as equality of opportunity, not as equality of outcome, which I see as a clearly defined Marxist aim. I heard an argument for a modified social distribution of wealth, but that's already part and parcel of most modern free market states, with a wide variation and an appropriate variation of government intervention, all of which...
I was actually kind of nodding off there for a little while because I was indifferent to this until he said that, and then I got frustrated again.
Is necessary to flatten the tendency of hierarchies to become tilted so terribly that only the people at the top have everything and all of the people at the bottom have nothing. It's a very difficult battle to fight against that profound tendency, much deeper than the tendency of capitalism itself, and we don't exactly know what to do about it. So we run experiments, and that seems to be working perfectly reasonably, as far as I can tell.
What?
Let's see. Well, I'll close with this. Capitalism in the free market, well, that's the worst form of social organization possible, as I said, except for all the others. There is a positive relationship between economics measured by income and happiness, or psychological well-being, which might be the absence of misery. I certainly do not believe, and the evidence does not suggest, that material security is sufficient. I do believe, however, that insofar as there is a relationship between happiness and material security, that the free market system has demonstrated itself as the most efficient manner to achieve that, and that was actually the terms of the argument. So thus, if it's capitalism versus Marxism with regards to human happiness, it's still the case that the free market constitutes the clear winner. And maybe capitalism will not solve our problems. I actually don't believe that it will. I've in fact argued that the proper pathway forward is one of individual moral responsibility aimed at the highest good. It's something for me that's rooted in our underlying Judeo-Christian tradition that insists that each person is is sovereign in their own right and a locus of ultimate value, which is something that you can accept regardless of your religious presuppositions, and something that you do accept if you participate in a society such as ours. Even the fact that you vote, that you're charged with that responsibility, is an indication that our society is structured such that we presume that each person is a locus of responsibility and decision-making of such import that the very stability of the state depends upon the integrity of their the integrity of their character. And so what I've been suggesting to people is that they adopt as much responsibility as they possibly can in keeping with that, in keeping with their aim at the highest possible good, which to me is something approximating a balance between what's good for you as an individual and what's good for your family, in keeping with what's good for you as an individual, and then what's good for society in the larger frame, such that it's also good for you and your family. And that's a form of an elaborated, iterated game, a form of elaborated cooperation. It's a sophisticated way of looking at the ways society could possibly be organized. And I happen to believe that that has to happen at the individual level first. And that's the pathway forward that I see. And so that's my 10-minute commentary.
I wanted to say right now, McDonald's workers are on strike in 15 cities, demanding $15 an hour. They should get more, but a partial improvement. And things like this always occur to me whenever he makes this kind of point, because to my mind, if you were able to actually secure $15 an hour for McDonald's workers, not only would that be a huge improvement for your own life and a seminal accomplishment in your career, but it would also benefit everyone coming afterwards who happened to get shunted into that job. And I say this as somebody who worked at McDonald's for a little while. It's a crappy job. Good people, we had a lot of laughs and stuff like that. But you absolutely should get $15 an hour. And if those people on strike right now happen to win that, I'll consider that a seminal achievement and a real example of someone taking both individual and collective responsibility into their own hands.
Yeah, I mean, amen to that. I think that it is really striking. So, like right now, those McDonald's workers, are are on strike for $15 an hour. Meanwhile, the CEO of McDonald's, his total compensation for 2019 was $18 million and change. That's approximately 1,939 times.
That's a lot of Big Macs.
As much as the annual wages of the average worker at McDonald's. We just had a unionization campaign, failed unionization campaign in Bessemer, Alabama, for the Amazon warehouse there, where during the fight over that, the company tried to deny and then kind of had to back down on their denial that Amazon workers routinely pee in bottles and shit in bags, because that's the only way to make the demanding quotas that are enforced by constant electronic surveillance. And this is the same time as the CEO of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, is literally says things to interviewers like the only way I can think of to capitalize, my what he calls, with admirable self-awareness, his winnings from Amazon would be to go into space. And he's done things like buy this Millennium Clock that there are like certain things that the clock only does once every 100 years and things like that, because like you just cannot come up with ways to spend all this money. That unionization campaign failed, by the way, and some of the surveys of workers who voted no say one of their big motivations for voting no is they're worried that Amazon would close the plant and they'd lose their health insurance, since that's employer linked right now. So it's a very potent threat. It's a nice health insurance plan you've got there. Shame if something happened to it. Meanwhile, in the same society where people like Jeff Bezos exist, or where people like Chris Kempczynski, the CEO of McDonald's, exist. People like Shane Patrick Boyle exist. Shane Patrick Boyle was a diabetic who died while the GoFundMe to pay for his insulin, was not quite funded. He was raising money to try to buy 1 month's worth of insulin. And we also live in a society where the Biden administration has just come around on this, so we're actually in a little bit of a retro news cycle where the Germans get to be the bad guys for a while, while the EU is deciding, is pushing back against this, but we are confronted with this major issue about whether to waive WTO enforcement for vaccine patents. Vaccines, by the way, developed with public money for the most part. That have the effect of stopping people in countries in the global south from producing the vaccine. So, which would have, has effects in countries like India that are downright genocidal. But also forget that just in self-interest terms, it's not only murder; it's murder-suicide. Because if the virus is allowed to run rampant in third world countries, then it's much more likely that we'll eventually get a variant that's resistant to vaccines. We'll all be fucked back here too. So I don't know. It seems to me that when Jordan Peterson says, well, there's this effect of hierarchies that, they can tilt too much to the top, and, it's not quite clear what to do about it. So, and we don't want to mess with things too much, or, we'll kill the goose that lays the golden egg. So we're running experiments. He says the experiments are going well. I'm not convinced.
Yeah, there was. I mean, that part in particular was hard to swallow. As was the. What did he claim about Marxism? That it was
quality of outcome.
Yeah, I mean, well, I actually was going to say this earlier, but I was looking up the transcript of the debate, and which by the way, a friend / acquaintance of mine was trying to put out as a book. Slavoj, gave his blessing to it. Peterson wanted all kinds of cash in order to do that, so it's not going to happen anytime soon. But there was a point, and maybe we can talk about this next time, because there were a number of people on the left who were angry or like mad at Žižek for not explicitly defending Marxism in the way that somebody like Richard Wolff might have done. But there was that portion where Žižek sounded an awful lot like Marx in the German ideology, right? When he says that as soon as I'm just reading from German ideology, as soon as the distribution of labor comes into being, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisher, a herdsman, or a critical critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. While in communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, etc. Right? So this idea that that everything is going to just be the way that Peterson paints it is like the sort of bad libertarian critique of a utopia, right? Where we're all going to be wearing the same Star Trek outfit and no freedom whatsoever. Right? The idea that Marxism is just going to, well, even using the term Marxism, I think, Ben, you mentioned last week, there's a sort of category error here. It should be either socialism or communism versus capitalism, right? As opposed to Marxism. But the idea that if you were to implement this, then sort of any sort of individuality just gets entirely stomped out of you. And everyone is going to be the same and it'll be entirely anodyne is not, to stick to the term Marxism is certainly not what Marx envisioned.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say the one point where I could empathize with Peterson a little bit and empathize with critics of socialism is where he said, I didn't really hear a well spelled out alternative presented by Slavoj Žižek. And Ben, I know you're writing a book about this, so maybe you have some thoughts on it.
I was going to say, in maybe late 2022, you can get the alternative then. That's when the new book should come out from Verso. But yeah, I mean, I do also, and actually also, I would recommend David Schweikart's book, After Capitalism, which I think is out of the books like that are extant, is the one that I like the best. Also, one of my co-authors on the new book from Verso, Bhaskar Sankara, is in the first chapter of his book, The Communist Manifesto. The Socialist Manifesto, Communist Manifesto was written before that. Socialist Manifesto. He has, I think he has some plausible thoughts on that there. So, there is stuff that's out there. But yeah, I agree. I mean, this is actually the first time I talked to, hey, I've had 2 conversations with the dude. I should train myself to start saying Slavoj. But anyway, the first time I talked to the man, I had this is something we talked about a little bit then. There's this business about what Marx called writing recipes for the cook shops of the future, and I agree with you, Matt. I think it is. I think it is important. I think that you do have to. All due respect to Marx's line in that Introduction to Capital, where he says it's not going to do that. I think at a certain point you do have to start writing those recipes, or people won't think they'll have anything to eat in the future. So I do agree with that, but also like I really like that Russ read that passage from the German ideology, because that's it's an important point, and one that's often missed, that the normative value that is that Marx and Engels are willing to explicitly talk about is freedom, and this is and most obviously freedom from having to kowtow to unelected bosses, which you can get through workers' control amidst production, but ultimately a deeper kind of freedom, kind of spend your time how you want, which is something that we could maybe get under like what the kids call fully automated luxury communism, which I think is definitely an ideal that's worth striving for, even if it's never entirely achieved. I think just getting closer to that, right? Like having a society, which I don't think you can do under capitalism. Like Keynes thought you could do it under capitalism, but I think he's just, I think we've proven that that's wrong, because there's been so much automation, since Keynes was writing, where advances in automation don't mean that some people just lose their jobs until new industries can develop or whatever, but that they mean that everybody has to work less. And so if everybody's working less, then yeah, you can spend your time on projects of your choosing, whether that's hunting and fishing, or whatever, writing bad poetry, doing what you want, that you can do what you want with your life, in ways that you just can't if everybody, if you just have to scramble all the time, to work all the time, just to survive.
Well, that's what's most perverse, I think, about our stage of late capitalism, is that everything that, if you take care of the material needs, that for Marx is what enables your freedom to flourish as speaking about like individuals, right? I think Marx has far more respect for individual pursuits than, the modern day late capitalist. But what's so perverse, right, is that everything that, that is the basis for unfreedom in Marx's system is sold to us as the basis of freedom under late capitalism, right? Be your own boss. Why would you want to work 40 hours for one place? Work, and so instead of instead of having all of your material
hours for 6 places.
Yeah, it's like instead of fishing, hunting, being a critic, it's like the idea of freedom under neoliberalism is ride for Uber, all these other basically gig economies that enables you to be quote unquote free, to be your own boss, right? I mean, so that very unfreedom of always having to work, all these different jobs, because no one will schedule you or hire you give you a 40-hour work week, because then they'll have to pay you benefits. But that somehow is freedom. You're right. That's the greatest freedom that we can imagine under our current system.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to end with a comment about that, because I think it's absolutely true that Marx is committed to the Enlightenment project of human freedom for all. But in a very Hegelian way, he understands that the freedom for each individual is dependent upon freedom for all individuals, and changes in the social and material conditions within which we live. And one of the odd things is how Jordan Peterson, again, stresses that he sees this kind of Lockean possessive individualism as being deeply coincident with the Judeo-Christian tradition. Whereas I always like to point out that Jesus is one of the people who said in the Gospel of John that in order to be free, you have to follow this commandment, which is that you love another as you love yourself. Do you really think that the people who are trying to deny McDonald's workers $15 an hour in order to serve them fries love those people as they love themselves? Probably not, right? So if you actually take the Judeo-Christian idea of freedom as espoused in the Bible and in Marx seriously, then that means you need to recognize that you have an obligation to try to secure human capabilities, not just for yourself, but for everybody. And in fact, the only way you're ultimately going to obtain full human capabilities for yourself is when everyone has the same capabilities.
Yeah, really quickly, Matt, because this is actually an interesting historical factoid, I guess. But I think Ben mentioned toward the end of last week when we were talking about, the one president who read Marx was Lincoln.
All right.
And because Marx was publishing in the Tribune, well, actually, the great American transcendentalist Margaret Fuller, who in the 1840s, actually, well, the mid to late 1840s, traveled to Europe. She was the first international female correspondent for a major newspaper, and she actually joined the Italian Revolution and she was in the thick of it in 48. But anyway, in the very same pages of the Tribune where Marx was publishing his pieces, she has a line that would be part of her book, Women in the 19th Century from 1845, but that is, and I'm paraphrasing here, but basically she says, as long as there is one person who is, laying in the sod and is entirely, being lorded over, no one is free. So one not free, no one is free.
That's very well put. Yeah.
It's a very Marxist. I'll have to find the exact quote, but it just, the uncanniness of those lines appearing alongside those of Marx in the Tribune is amazing.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think all this did have some effect on Lincoln. We talked about this when Alex Gurevich and Matt Karp were on last year. That some of the Lincoln stuff on wage, labor, and capital, whereas there is a tradition of, I think, socialist writers taking some of it out of context and getting a little bit too excited about it. That definitely happens. But also, even if you do the careful reading in context of what he was saying, like there is a sort of radical underlying thought there, even if obviously Lincoln didn't have like anti-capitalist solutions to it, which is that like Lincoln did say, right, in the big speech where he talks about labor and capital, that you're not really free if you're spending your entire life as a wage labor. Now, his solution to that is basically that you you eventually like get some land and you're like a independent producer, and I think even by the time he was writing, that was a little bit anachronistic. Obviously today it's over the top anachronistic, but it's still there's still like a good socialist insight there, that like you can't that if you're spending your entire working life taking orders as a worker under capitalism, which of course you are. I mean, even if you're driving an Uber in the morning and doing whatever you're doing in the afternoon, and at night you're sleeping on the couch because you're renting out your bed as an Airbnb thing, then like you're not, of course, your own boss. They're like you're a bunch of like you just have like a few different bosses at those different those different companies. But I think that's like that if that's your situation, you're not free. And since I know we do need to cut it off for tonight, for part 2 of 3, before the trilogy is completed next time, I will just say Marxism says equality of outcome. No, it damn well does not. See part 1 for extensive discussion of that. But the one thing I did want to make sure we didn't let go of was how interested it was that at the end, I think Peterson kind of without realizing talked himself into like a pretty socialist place in the end of his remarks, because he was going on about individual responsibility. And of course, that's just usual ridiculous conservative stuff. We're going to solve major societal problems by just like a bunch of individuals just living their individual lives better, but which, man, why didn't that happen already? But when he was going on and on about individual responsibility and so how it's so important, he said individual responsibility is recognized in the structure of our society through voting, because you're entrusted with this responsibility over the whole thing. It's like, man, we are like, conceptually, we're like an inch and a half from Comrade Peterson here, having a major breakthrough, because if voting is such a good like expression of individuality, then hell, I mean, extend that to the economy and we're good.
Yeah.
Well said.
All right, guys. So let me just, is there anything either of you want to plug before we go?
I will plug our Plastic Pills episode tomorrow. We'll be looking at Jason Brennan's book on libertarianism. For those who are interested, it should be out later this week, and it'll be a swell old time.
Fair enough.
I'm just gonna plug. I have nothing actually to plug. I'm just gonna plug being done with grading by the end of the week, hopefully. So
That is
I'm looking forward to part 3. So
fair enough. That is a very nice feeling. I will just quickly say a couple things. The fact that I talk about the Žižek Peterson debate at the end of the new book is a good enough reason to remind people that book exists. Cancel Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left. I've also already mentioned that in the GTAA episode, same channel, tomorrow night at 8 p.m., Sam Cedar is going to come on to talk about as many libertarian debates. We're also going to have Toure Reed and Jason Miles on in that episode. And on Wednesday, we go for the movie live stream. I'm going to be talking about Total Recall with Ryan Lake and Forrest Miller, our producer. For Philosophy Friday, I'm not quite sure, but Sunday we'll be back here doing this again, completing the trilogy. So please do come check that out on Sunday. Thank you guys for coming. We'll see everybody then. Left is best.